The first time I saw the man, he was wearing my uniform. I was watching a security monitor in the housekeeping office when he stepped out of a crew elevator 3 decks below me. The camera image was grainy, but I could clearly see the dark trousers, white shirt, and burgundy vest worn by accommodation supervisors. He even had a rectangular name badge attached to his chest. My name badge. The man kept his head lowered as he walked past the camera. A baseball cap concealed most of his face, and he moved with the relaxed confidence of someone who knew exactly where he was going. He turned into a crew-only corridor and disappeared from view. At that moment, my real uniform was on my body. My real name badge was pinned on my chest. And according to security, no other accommodation supervisor was working on that part of the ship. That is when we finally understood that the unexplained incidents from the previous month were connected. Someone had been living aboard the ship without appearing on any crew or passenger list. Someone who had access to our uniforms, our schedules, our cabins, and nearly every restricted area below deck. And by the time we realized it, he had already learned enough about me to pretend that he was me. I worked aboard a large cruise ship for 4 contracts. Every contract lasted between 6 and 8 months. I supervised part of the overnight housekeeping department, which meant I spent most of my working hours moving through the ship while passengers slept. The ship carried more than 2,000 adult passengers and almost 900 adult crew members. From the outside, it looked elegant. There were restaurants, theaters, lounges, pools, shops, and rows of balcony cabins overlooking the ocean. The crew saw a different ship. Below the passenger decks were narrow metal corridors, industrial laundries, storage rooms, mechanical spaces, crew cabins, food lockers, workshops, and stairwells that never appeared on the maps given to guests. The lower decks were loud even in the middle of the night. Pipes rattled behind the walls. Ventilation fans ran constantly. Water moved through machinery beneath the floor. Steel doors expanded and contracted whenever the temperature changed. After several months aboard, most crew members stopped noticing the sounds. That was why the knocking went unreported for so long. The first complaint came from an adult cabin steward assigned to a passenger deck near the middle of the ship. He told me he kept hearing 3 knocks from inside a linen storage wall. The linen room was a narrow compartment between 2 sections of passenger cabins. It contained shelves of towels, sheets, toiletries, and cleaning supplies. The rear wall was made from painted metal panels. Behind this panel should have been plumbing and electrical lines. The steward said the knocking usually happened after 2 in the morning. 3 slow knocks. A pause. Then 3 more. He assumed another employee was working in the service passage on the opposite side. There was no service passage on the ship's official deck plan. I inspected the room with him. Nothing appeared unusual. The rear wall was solid. The shelves were properly secured. There were no ventilation openings large enough for an animal to enter. I placed my hand against the metal and felt the vibration from the ship's engines. I told the steward he was probably hearing a loose pipe. He accepted that explanation. 2 nights later, he called me on the radio. I could hear panic in his voice. He said the knocking had started again. This time, he knocked back. 3 times. Whatever was behind the wall answered immediately. 3 knocks. He moved to the opposite side of the linen room and struck a different panel. The sound followed him. 3 knocks came from directly behind his hand. When I arrived, the room was empty except for the steward. We contacted the maintenance department. 2 adult technicians removed several wall panels. Behind them were insulated pipes, electrical cables, and a narrow vertical gap between structural supports. The gap was less than half a meter wide. It looked too small for an adult to enter. The technicians found nothing loose enough to cause the knocking. One of them climbed partially into the opening with a flashlight. He could see several meters downward before pipes blocked the view. He found a crushed plastic water bottle resting on the support beam. The bottle did not belong there. It was the same brand supplied in the crew dining room. The technicians assumed another worker had dropped it during an earlier repair. They replaced the panels and closed the linen room. The incident should have ended there. Instead, strange things began happening in other areas of the ship. Uniforms disappeared from the laundry. At first, no one considered it serious. Crew members frequently misplaced clothing. Uniforms were sent through industrial washing machines in large batches, and items occasionally ended up in the wrong department. But these uniforms were being removed from locked distribution racks. 2 housekeeping shirts disappeared. Then a maintenance coverall. Then a security jacket. Then a gallery uniform. All of them were adult, medium, or large sizes. None of them were ever returned. Radios also began disappearing. The housekeeping department lost 3 radios in less than a week. One vanished from the charging station inside my office. The door had been locked. Only supervisors and managers had access. Security checked the electronic lock record. My keycard had opened the office shortly after 3 in the morning. I had been cleaning an incident on a passenger deck at that time. The camera outside the office showed no one approaching the door. There was a 6-minute gap in the recording. The security department blamed a temporary network failure. When I entered the office later, the charging station was empty. The missing radio remained connected to the ship's internal channel for almost 2 hours. Someone pressed the transmission button several times but never spoke. We could hear breathing. Then the radio went silent near the lowest crew deck. The battery was never found. The first passenger complaint happened during the following voyage. An adult woman traveling alone contacted guest services shortly before 4 in the morning. She said a crew member had entered her cabin without permission. The woman had been asleep when the bathroom light turned on. She opened her eyes and saw a man standing near the foot of the bed. He wore a white housekeeping shirt and dark trousers. His face was partially concealed by the medical mask. The woman asked what he was doing. The man did not answer. He slowly looked around the cabin, as though checking whether anything had changed. Then he walked into the corridor and closed the door behind him. The woman called guest services immediately. Security searched the deck. No one matching the description was found. The cabin's electronic lock showed that a housekeeping master key had opened the door. The key belonged to an adult steward working on a different deck. Security searched the steward. His master key was clipped to his belt. He had not reported it missing. The lock system should have accepted a duplicate. Every crew keycard contained an identification number. Even if someone copied the magnetic data, the system was supposed to reject 2 cards using the same number within a short period. The security department removed the steward's access and issued him a replacement. They examined the passenger's cabin for stolen property. Nothing was missing. There were no signs of forced entry. The only unusual detail was the bathroom mirror. Someone had drawn a small circle in the fogged glass. The circle surrounded the reflection of the bed. The woman requested another cabin. The company apologized and gave her a credit. The official explanation was that an employee had entered the wrong room. The steward whose key had been copied was formally warned, even though he insisted he had never left his deck. After that, housekeeping employees were ordered to keep their keys beneath their clothing. We also started checking every crew member entering passenger corridors after midnight. The precautions did not stop the incidents. A week later, an adult bartender woke inside his crew cabin and found the door open. His roommate was working. The bartender had locked the door before going to sleep. Nothing had been stolen. His phone, wallet, passport, and watch remained beside the bed. However, a chair had been moved from the desk to the center of the room. It faced his bed. On the seat was a folded housekeeping towel. The bartender reported it to security. The lock records showed that his cabin had been opened by a mechanical emergency key. Mechanical keys did not produce electronic records. Only senior officers in the security department were supposed to possess them. Every emergency key was accounted for. The bartender refused to sleep in the cabin again. He stayed with another crew member for the rest of the voyage. Several days later, we found a photograph inside his original room. It had been pushed through the ventilation grill above the door. The photograph showed the bartender asleep. It had been taken from the chair. Security immediately searched the crew accommodation decks. Every available officer participated. They opened empty cabins, checked lockers, searched storage rooms, and inspected the lifeboat access areas. They reviewed crew records for anyone who had failed to sign off after a completed contract. No one was missing. Everyone aboard appeared on a passenger list, crew manifest, contractor permit, or visitor record. The possibility of a stowaway was discussed, but management considered it unlikely. The ship used electronic checkpoints at every entrance. Crew members scanned their cards when leaving or returning in port. Passengers passed through facial recognition cameras. Contractors received temporary badges and were escorted in restricted areas. Someone could hide during a single voyage. Hiding for weeks would require food, water, clothing, and knowledge of the ship. Security believed the person responsible was probably a crew member. That theory damaged trust almost immediately. Crew members started accusing one another. People checked beneath beds before sleeping. Some placed tape across their doors so they could tell whether anyone entered while they were gone. Others installed small personal cameras inside their cabins. Housekeeping staff were treated with suspicion because the intruder had used our uniforms and access codes. I began checking the office lock every few minutes. I kept my master key inside a zipped pocket. I carried my radio everywhere, including the restroom. Then I received a cleaning request from cabin 4187. The request appeared on my handheld device at 2:17 in the morning. The message said, "Bathroom flood. Urgent." Cabin 4187 was not occupied. A pipe had leaked behind the shower during the previous voyage. Maintenance repaired the pipe, but the cabin remained unavailable while the wall dried. Its electronic lock had been disabled. The room should have been empty and secured. I assumed the technician had entered and accidentally activated the service panel. I contacted maintenance. No one was assigned to that cabin. I asked security to meet me there. An officer said he was dealing with another call and would arrive when available. I took an adult night steward with me. We reached the passenger corridor a few minutes later. The door to cabin 4187 was slightly open. The steward called out. No one answered. We entered together. The cabin felt warm and humid. The bathroom light was on. The shower had recently been used. Water covered the floor, but there was no active leak. A wet towel lay near the drain. The bed had been stripped of its protective cover. Someone had placed regular sheets and blankets on it. The pillow contained a deep indentation. On the desk were several empty food containers from the crew dining room. The expiration labels showed that the meals had been collected over the previous 4 days. The closet contained 2 housekeeping shirts, a maintenance coverall, a security jacket, and a pair of dark trousers. There were the missing uniforms. A collection of stolen crew property filled one drawer. Radios, key cards, name badges, locker keys, small flashlights, disposable masks, work gloves. There were photographs as well. Dozens of them. Most showed crew members moving through restricted areas. Some were taken inside the dining room. Others showed employees entering the cabins. Several photographs had been taken through ventilation grills. I recognized the adult bartender sleeping in his bed. I found a picture of the steward standing beside me. Then I found one of myself. I was sitting alone in the housekeeping office. The photograph had been taken from above. I looked toward the ceiling. A ventilation panel was positioned directly over the desk. The steward and I left the cabin immediately. We waited in the corridor until security arrived. The entire deck was closed. Officers searched every cabin and service area. They found no one. Security reviewed the electronic lock. The door to cabin 4187 had not recorded any activity for 11 days. Someone had been entering through another route. Maintenance removed the bathroom access panels. Behind the shower was a utility space containing water lines and ventilation ducts. A narrow opening had been cut through a layer of insulation. On the other side was a vertical service trunk extending through several decks. The truck did not appear on the maintenance plan stored aboard the ship. An engineer later discovered it on an old construction drawing. It had been used during the ship's original assembly to carry temporary cables between decks. The upper and lower entrances were supposed to have been permanently sealed before the ship entered service. One entrance had never been sealed. It opened behind shelving in the crew storage room. Someone had removed part of the shelving and created a concealed door. The service trunk was narrow but large enough for an adult to climb through. Makeshift metal steps had been bolted into the frame. Ropes connected the different levels. Small battery lights were attached to the walls. The person responsible had created a private passage through the center of the ship. From that passage, he could access ventilation spaces, linen rooms, crew corridors, and several passenger cabins undergoing maintenance. He could move between decks without using elevators or stairs. The construction was not recent. Some of the bolts showed years of corrosion. Security entered the trunk from the storage room. The search team found water bottles, food wrappers, blankets, batteries, stolen tools, and hand-drawn maps. There were small resting platforms between levels. One contained a mattress made from folded towels. Another held a portable radio scanner. The scanner was programmed to monitor housekeeping. maintenance, security, and bridge communications. The intruder could hear us searching for him. He knew which decks were being checked. He knew when security officers moved away. A notebook contained crew schedules copied from department offices. Beside each schedule were handwritten observations. Which employees worked alone? Which employees left their doors unlocked? Which supervisors carried master keys? Which officers skipped inspections? My schedule appeared several times. Beside my name were short notes. Check rooms carefully. Responds before security. Carries key on left side. Lives alone. That last statement was wrong. I shared my crew cabin with another supervisor, but my roommate had left the ship unexpectedly because of a family emergency. Only a few people knew I was temporarily alone. Someone had been listening to private crew conversations. A second notebook contained descriptions of our voices. It listed phrases people used on the radio. My section included the way I confirmed cabin numbers, the order in which I gave instructions, and the expressions I used whenever someone apologized for waking me. The writer was not simply watching us, he was studying us. Security sealed every opening they could locate. The ship arrived in port the following morning. Local authorities boarded before passengers were allowed to leave. Search teams spent almost 9 hours inspecting the service trunk and nearby compartments. Tracking dogs moved through the lower decks. Thermal cameras were aimed into wall spaces. Every crew member's identity was checked. No unauthorized person was found. The authorities collected the photographs and notebooks. Management arranged for temporary guards to patrol the storage room. The voyage was delayed, but the company did not cancel the next departure. Most passengers had no idea what happened. They were told the delay involved a technical inspection. Several crew members resigned. Others demanded transfers. I considered leaving, but abandoning a contract without approval could affect future employment and travel arrangements. Management assured us that the hidden passage had been sealed. They believed the intruder escaped during an earlier port visit. For 2 nights, nothing happened. Then an adult steward disappeared. He was the same steward who had originally reported the knocking in the linen room. He started working shortly before midnight. At 1:40 in the morning, he spoke to me on the radio. He said someone had opened a supply locker at the end of his corridor. When he checked it, he found a security cap resting on the floor. The cap was still warm. I told him to leave the area and wait for security. He acknowledged the instruction. He never arrived at the meeting point. His radio was found inside the service elevator. His master key was missing. Security locked down the crew decks. The bridge made repeated announcements asking him to contact an officer. Every camera recording from the previous hour was reviewed. One camera showed the steward walking into the linen room where the knocking had started. He was alone. 40 seconds later, the lights in the corridor went out. The camera continued recording in night mode. A second figure emerged from the linen room. He wore the steward's uniform. He kept his face turned away from the camera. The figure pushed the housekeeping cart toward the service elevator. From a distance, he looked like the missing steward. But when investigators slowed the footage, they noticed something underneath the cart. A hand. The missing steward had been placed inside the lower linen compartment. The cart entered the service elevator. The lights returned. The elevator camera had stopped recording during the trip. When the doors opened on the lowest crew deck, the cart was empty. The person pushing it was gone. Search teams reopened the concealed service trunk. One of the metal seals had been cut from the inside. Security officers climbed through every section. They found the steward almost 12 hours later. He was alive. He had been locked inside a maintenance compartment near the ship's stabilizer machinery. His wrists and ankles had been restrained with plastic ties, and tape covered his mouth. He was dehydrated and terrified, but not seriously injured. He said he had entered the linen room after hearing movement behind the shelves. A man in a security uniform stepped from the wall. The man carried a radio and a ring of mechanical keys. He knew the steward's name. He told the steward that security needed his assistance. When the steward turned around, the man grabbed him from behind. The steward remembered being placed inside the cart. He said the intruder spoke calmly while moving him. The man explained that no one truly belonged aboard the ship. Passengers rented cabins. Crew members rented identities. Everyone eventually left. The ship was the only thing that remained. Before locking the steward in the maintenance compartment, the man removed his name badge and said, "You finished your contract early." The steward was taken ashore for treatment. He never returned. The company finally agreed to suspend operations after the voyage ended. Until then, we still had passengers aboard. Security doubled its patrols. Crew members were instructed to travel in pairs. Mechanical keys were replaced. Uniform distribution was moved to a guarded room. Temporary cameras were installed near every known opening into the service trunk. That was the night I saw the man wearing my uniform. I was inside the housekeeping office with 2 security officers reviewing the new camera feeds. At 3:06 in the morning, one monitor showed an accommodation supervisor leaving the crew elevator. The burgundy vest immediately caught my attention. Only 2 people aboard were supposed to wear that uniform overnight. One was sitting beside me. The other was me. The figure wore a baseball cap pulled low over his face. My name badge was attached to his vest. I touched my chest to confirm that my real badge was still there. One officer used the radio to alert the patrol team. The man on the monitor stopped walking. He slowly raised his head toward the camera. For a moment, I could see part of his face. He was an adult, probably in his late 40s or early 50s. His skin was pale from spending little time in sunlight. He had short hair and deep shadows around his eyes. He smiled directly at the camera. Then he raised a radio to his mouth. My radio produced a burst of static. A voice said, "Cabin 4187, bathroom flood, urgent." The voice sounded like mine. Not perfectly, but close enough that someone listening quickly might have believed it. The man had recorded my radio calls and practiced copying me. Security officers rushed toward the corridor. The man opened a crew cabin door with a mechanical key and disappeared inside. The officers reached the cabin less than a minute later. It belonged to an adult kitchen employee who was working at the time. The room was empty. A section of the closet wall had been removed. Behind it was another entrance into the service trunk. We thought we had discovered every opening. We were wrong. The intruder had spent years modifying the ship. He knew spaces that did not exist on our plans. The bridge ordered all available security personnel to search the lower decks. I was told to remain in the office. A security officer stayed with me while the other left. For several minutes, we listened to radio traffic. Patrol teams moved through the storage rooms. Engineers checked access points. No one found the man. Then every camera feed in the office went black. The lights remained on. The computer screens displayed a connection error. The officer tried contacting the security control room. No one answered. We heard a noise above us. 3 slow knocks came from the ventilation panel. The officer drew his baton and moved beneath the vent. Dust fell from the frame. The panel shifted downward. We backed away. Nothing came through. Instead, a voice spoke from inside the ceiling. It was my voice again. Respond before security. The words came from the notebook. The officer ordered the person to show himself. There was a short laugh. Then we heard movement traveling through the ceiling toward the corridor. The officer opened the office door. The hallway was empty. A housekeeping cart stood near the service elevator. It had not been there before. The officer approached it carefully. The shelves contained folded towels and cleaning supplies. A radio rested on top. My missing office radio. A photograph had been taped to its screen. The picture showed me sleeping in my crew cabin. The roommate's bed was empty. The photograph had been taken less than a week earlier. On the back, someone had written, "Supervisor rests at 5:40. A loud metallic impact came from inside the office. The door slammed shut behind us. The electronic lock activated. The security officer tried his key card. It did not work. Smoke began seeping from beneath the door. The intruder had released a fire extinguishing canister inside the office. It produced thick white vapor that blocked the camera and filled the room. The officer called for assistance while I used my master key on a neighboring service door. We entered a narrow corridor behind the offices. The passage connected to the laundry deck. We could hear someone following us. Not running. Walking. Slow, steady footsteps echoed through the vapor. The security officer tried his key card. It did not work. Smoke began seeping from beneath the door. The intruder had released a fire extinguishing canister inside the office. It produced thick white vapor that blocked the camera and filled the room. The officer called for assistance while I used my master key on a neighboring service door. We entered a narrow corridor behind the offices. The passage connected to the laundry deck. We could hear someone following us. Not running. Walking. Slow, steady footsteps echoed through the vapor. The officer told me to stay behind him. We reached a junction near the industrial laundry. One direction led to the main crew corridor. The other led to an older section of the ship used for storing damaged furniture. The main corridor door would not open. Someone had lowered the fire barrier manually. The footsteps continued approaching. We entered the storage section and locked the door. The room contained mattresses, broken chairs, rolled carpets, and stacks of box equipment. There were several exits, but most had been chained shut during the security lockdown. The officer radioed our location. Static answered. Then my copied voice spoke through the radio. Checks rooms carefully. The officer switched channels. The same voice followed us. Carries key on left side. I placed my hand over the pocket containing my master key. The officer looked at me. The intruder knew exactly what we were doing. Somewhere nearby, he could see us. We searched the ceiling and walls. A small lens was hidden inside a smoke detector above the storage shelves. The officer struck it with his baton. The copied voice stopped. A few seconds later, the real security control room contacted us. They said teams were approaching from the laundry deck. The locked fire barrier began rising. We waited for the opening to become large enough to crawl underneath. Before it did, something moved behind the stacked mattresses. The officer aimed his flashlight. A man stood in the narrow gap between the mattresses and the wall. He wore my burgundy vest. My copy name badge remained pinned to his chest. The baseball cap was gone. His face was thin and expressionless. He had been inside the storage room with us the entire time. The officer ordered him to get on the floor. The man looked at me instead. He said my usual radio confirmation phrase in a perfect imitation of my voice. Then he pulled a lever mounted behind the mattress. The lights went out. A steel door opened somewhere behind him. The officer rushed forward. By the time emergency lighting activated, the man had disappeared. Behind the mattresses was a maintenance shaft leading downward. It had been concealed with a removable wall panel. The shaft descended toward the machinery decks. Security teams entered from the laundry corridor and followed it. The passage connected to an unused waste processing compartment. Inside, they found the largest hiding area yet. The intruder had converted it into a private cabin. There was a bed, a desk, food storage, fresh water, uniforms from almost every department, boxes of employee identification cards, mechanical keys, radios, medical masks, hair cutting tools, skin products, glasses with non-prescription lenses. He had collected everything he needed to change his appearance. The walls were covered with crew photographs. Some employees were shown from several angles: front, side, walking, eating, sleeping. Beside each photograph were physical measurements and observations: approximate height, weight, uniform size, dominant hand, walking speed, accent, common expressions, work habits. He had selected several crew members whose appearance was similar to his. Most worked alone at night. Several had recently completed contracts and left the ship. The intruder had been using their uniforms and identities after they signed off. He did not need to resemble them closely. Crew members changed constantly. Most passengers could not tell one employee from another. In restricted areas, a uniform and confident behavior were often enough. One wall was devoted to me. It contained copies of my schedule, photographs of my cabin, recordings of my voice, and instructions describing my duties. A spare burgundy vest hung from a hook. Another copy of my name badge rested on the desk. The badge was nearly perfect. Only the employee number on the back was incorrect. A calendar displayed the remaining days of my contract. Every date after the next port visit had been crossed out. Beneath the calendar was a printed crew transfer document. It said that I would leave the ship because of a personal emergency. The document included my employee number and a copy of my signature. The signature was accurate. The intruder had practiced it across several pages. Another form authorized a replacement supervisor to join the ship under a temporary contract. The photograph attached to that form showed the intruder. He had planned to make me disappear during the next port visit. Then he intended to continue working under a different identity. Security found records suggesting he had done something similar before. Old crew manifests contained the names of employees who left unexpectedly. Several had reported lost passports, stolen luggage, or unexplained injuries shortly before signing off. One former employee had disappeared during shore leave years earlier. His belongings remained on board until the company shipped them to his family. The case had never been connected to the ship. The hidden room contained that employee's passport. It also contained his uniform and name badge. Authorities began treating the investigation as more than a stowaway case. The ship altered course toward the nearest suitable port. Every accessible machinery space was searched. Ventilation was monitored. Food and water were guarded. The intruder's space was distributed to all departments. No one was allowed to work alone. We reached port the following afternoon. Police and maritime officers boarded. Passengers left under controlled conditions. Each adult crew member was checked against identification records before leaving the vessel. Search teams examined the ship for 3 days. They found more hidden routes. A removable floor beneath the crew refrigerator. A panel inside a service elevator. A narrow path above the theater ceiling. An access opening behind a decorative wall in a passenger lounge. The intruder could move through much of the ship without entering public corridors. Investigators discovered how he originally boarded. Years earlier, while the vessel was undergoing major repairs, he worked for a subcontractor responsible for ventilation installation. His temporary position gave him access to unfinished spaces throughout the ship. Former co-workers remembered him as quiet and unusually interested in crew routines. He sometimes remained aboard after his shift ended. Tools and uniforms disappeared while he worked there. The contractor dismissed him for entering crew accommodation without permission. The shipyard removed his access badge. No one confirmed that he actually left the vessel. Investigators believe he hid in the unfinished service trunk until the ship departed. After that, he survived by stealing food, uniforms, and identification from the crew. He occasionally left in port wearing contractor clothing. He returned through provision entrances with delivery teams. Because crew members and contractors changed constantly, no one recognized that the same unauthorized man kept returning. He may have lived aboard for years. Despite the search, he was not found. One of the ship's floating doors had opened briefly during the night before we arrived in port. The system recorded a maintenance override. A camera showed a person in a reflective vest pushing a steel waste container onto the dock. The person wore a cap and mask. Dock workers assumed he belonged to the ship. The waste container was collected before police secured the area. By the time investigators located it, it was empty. The intruder had escaped again. The cruise company kept the ship out of service for several weeks. Construction specialists inspected every undocumented space they could access. Hidden compartments were sealed. Locks and cameras were replaced. Crew procedures changed. The company offered counseling and transfers to anyone who wanted them. I ended my contract early. I collected my belongings under security supervision and left the ship. Before departing, I inspected my crew cabin one final time. The bed had been removed so investigators could examine the floor. The ventilation grill had been replaced. The closet wall stood open. Behind it was a space barely wide enough for an adult to stand. A small platform had been installed inside. From that platform, someone could look through a tiny opening near the ceiling. The opening faced my bed. The intruder had not taken the photograph from the doorway. He had been inside the wall. Security found scratches in the metal where he rested his shoes. There were fresh food crumbs on the platform. He had spent time there repeatedly, possibly while I was awake. Possibly while I changed clothes. Possibly while I lay in bed listening to the pipes and assuming every sound was part of the ship. I returned home and found work in a hotel. I avoided ships and rarely spoke about what happened. The company instructed us not to discuss the investigation publicly. The official statement described the incident as an unauthorized access and security breach. It did not mention the photographs, hidden rooms, copied identities, or missing crew passport. Almost 3 years passed. Then I received an envelope with no return address. It had been mailed from a port city I had never visited. Inside was an old crew key card. The photograph on the card showed me. The name belonged to someone else. The job title said Accommodation Supervisor. The ship listed on the back was not the vessel where I had worked. It belonged to another cruise company. A recent photograph was included. It showed a staff lineup aboard the second ship. Dozens of adult crew members stood on an open deck wearing formal uniforms. Near the back of the group was a man in a burgundy vest. His hair was different. He wore glasses. His face appeared slightly heavier, but I recognized the shadows around his eyes. He was looking directly at the camera. On the back of the photograph he had written, Your contract is still available. I gave the envelope to the authorities. They contacted the other cruise company. By the time security searched that ship, the accommodation supervisor shown in the photograph had disappeared. His cabin was empty. His passport and personal belongings were gone. Employment records showed that he had joined the vessel only 4 months earlier. His references were false. The address on his application belonged to an abandoned building. The company could not confirm his real identity. They searched the ship's restricted spaces. Inside a ventilation compartment near the crew cabins, they found bottled water, stolen uniforms, photographs, and several copied key cards. One photograph showed an adult housekeeper asleep in her cabin. Another showed a supervisor working alone at night. A handwritten schedule was taped to the wall. Several names were circled. The authorities never told me whether mine was among them. I have not worked at sea since. I do not take cruises. I do not like staying in rooms with ventilation panels near the bed. Whenever I enter a hotel, I inspect the closet and measure the space between the interior wall and the hallway. I know most people would consider that irrational. The man probably moved on years ago. He may have been arrested under another identity. He may have died. But cruise ships still rely on temporary crews, changing contractors, complex service corridors, and hundreds of employees who do not know one another. Uniforms still disappear in industrial laundries. Keycards still get misplaced. Maintenance spaces still exist outside the view of ordinary passengers. And every day, crew members finish their contracts and are replaced by strangers. Most passengers never notice the difference. They see a uniform. They see a badge. They assume the person belongs there. This is what the man understood better than anyone. He did not need to own the ship. He did not need a real identity. He only needed an empty uniform. And somewhere beneath the passenger decks, he needed a space inside the wall where no one thought to look. I worked the overnight shift in one of the main galleys aboard a cruise ship. After the restaurants closed, my job was to help clean the preparation areas, organize supplies for breakfast, and move the leftover food into refrigerated storage. The galley looked completely different at night. During dinner service, it was crowded with adult cooks, servers, supervisors, and cleaning staff. After 2 in the morning, most of the lights were switched off. The stainless steel counters reflected the few lamps left on, ventilation fans hummed above the empty workstations, and every sound traveled through the room. One night, I was assigned to inventory the walk-in refrigerators. There were 3 large cold rooms at the rear of the galley. The first contained produce. The second held dairy products. The third was used for prepared ingredients and sealed containers from the previous service. Each refrigerator had a heavy insulated door. The doors could not be locked from the outside while someone was inside. A glowing release button allowed trapped workers to open them. That safety feature was tested every week. At around 2:40 in the morning, I entered the third refrigerator with a clipboard and a small handheld scanner. Nothing seemed unusual. Shelves filled both sides of the room. Containers were stacked from the floor almost to the ceiling. The air smelled like cold metal and cleaning solution. I had been inside for less than a minute when the door closed behind me. That was normal. The door was designed to shut automatically. I continued counting supplies. Then the lights went out. Emergency lighting should have activated immediately. It did not. The refrigerator became completely dark. I used the flashlight on my scanner and walked back to the door. The internal release button was not glowing. I pressed it anyway. Nothing happened. I pushed against the door with both hands. It did not move. I tried my radio. Only static came through. Cold rooms block radio signals. But I had used the same radio inside many times before. Usually, someone could at least hear a broken transmission. I began knocking on the door. 3 hard strikes. A pause. 3 more. No one answered. I told myself the night cleaner would eventually return. Then the refrigeration fan stopped. The silence was worse than the cold. A few seconds later, something knocked from the opposite end of the room. 3 slow strikes. They came from behind the shelves. I aimed the scanner light toward the sound. There was only a wall of metal racks and food containers. I called out. No answer. I knocked on the door again. The sound behind the shelves copied me. 3 strikes. Exactly the same rhythm. I moved closer. The rear shelf stood several centimeters away from the wall. As I approached, I noticed a thin line of light near the floor. It came from behind the lowest containers. Someone had cut a rectangular opening through the insulated wall. A metal panel had been placed over it and hidden by the shelving. I moved one container aside. The panel shifted inward. Warm air entered the refrigerator. Behind it was a narrow maintenance space filled with pipes and electrical cables. The passage should not have connected to the galley. A small battery lamp sat on the floor. Beside it were empty water bottles, food wrappers, a folded blanket, and a ship radio. Someone had been spending time inside the wall. I heard movement deeper in the passage. A shoe scraped against metal. I stepped backward. A man's voice came from the darkness. He calmly said my employee number. Then he said, "You are early." I ran to the refrigerator door and began striking it with the scanner. The voice behind me said my cabin number. Then it described which bed I used. I hit the door harder. The man told me to stop making noise. He said the galley supervisor had already left. He said the cleaner would not return for another 40 minutes. He knew the schedule. I turned toward the opening. The light inside the maintenance space had gone out. I could hear someone crawling toward the refrigerator. Containers shifted on the lower shelf. The metal panel began moving. I picked up a heavy plastic crate and held it in front of me. Before the panel opened completely, the refrigerator lights came back on. The fans restarted. The door release button glowed green. I pressed it and the door opened immediately. I ran into the galley. An adult cleaning employee stood near the sink. He looked confused when I shouted that someone was inside the wall. We locked the refrigerator door open and contacted security. Several officers and an engineer searched the cold room. They removed the rear shelf and opened the hidden panel. The maintenance space extended behind all three refrigerators. It connected to a ventilation room beneath the passenger dining area. The search team found a sleeping bag, stolen food, copied crew schedules, disposable gloves, and several small cameras. One camera had been installed inside the refrigerator's temperature display. Another faced the employee entrance to the galley. A collection of photographs showed adult workers entering storage rooms alone. Some images had times written across the back. My photograph had been taken 2 weeks earlier. The note beneath it said, "Usually late." That was why the voice said I was early. Security searched every connected space. They found no one. A maintenance hatch inside the ventilation room was open. It led to a crew stairwell several decks below. The refrigerator door had been disabled using a magnet placed inside its safety sensor. The lights and radio interference came from a small electronic device hidden above the shelves. Someone had deliberately trapped me. Management interviewed the galley employees. No one admitted knowing about the passage. Security reviewed the cameras outside the refrigerator. The recording showed me entering. 4 seconds later, the image froze. When it was resumed, I was running out. No one else appeared. The company recorded the event as an equipment malfunction and unauthorized use of a maintenance space. They repaired the wall and replaced the door mechanism. I requested a transfer to daytime work. It was denied. 2 nights later, I found a sealed food container on my station. Inside was the magnet used to disable the refrigerator door. Security had taken it as evidence. A small piece of paper had been taped beneath it. It contained only one sentence. "Next time, follow the schedule." I left the ship at the next port. The company tried to convince me to finish my contract, but I refused. Several months later, I contacted an adult worker who had remained aboard. He told me another employee had recently been trapped inside the same refrigerator. The door opened before security arrived. The employee claimed someone whispered to him through the rear wall. Maintenance removed the shelves again. The repaired panel was intact. No passage was found. But the hidden camera inside the temperature display had been replaced. This time, it was pointed directly at the emergency release button. The memory card contained hours of footage. Most of it showed an empty refrigerator. The final recording showed the door closing after the employee entered. The lights went out. Then, in the darkness, a voice near the camera whispered, "Let's see what he remembers."